That was a hot start. Just like
We're
knocked
here.
your boots off. So if you had your stereo in your car turned up all the way, we woke you up. Here we are. Thanks for joining us for the Take Two podcast. It is January 23rd. We're into the full first week of the legislative session. Maura Carabello with the Exoro group is here, and Nick Dunn from the Sutherland Institute. Welcome, both of you.
Nice to be here.
Yes, glad to have you. Tell me what you're busy with and what's up right now.
You know, I say lamenting. I'm going to start by lamenting. I was at the Hill 3 days this week, which I count as not a success story. And I was like, why am I here? But it is, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, it is a week of kickoffs and pomp and circumstances, which I don't hate. And so I got to see all the speeches. We had a few speeches this week. We had Supreme Court Justice, who doesn't get a lot of airplay on their speeches, and then, of course, the Speaker and the Senate President, and then the Governor closes down the show with the grand finale of the State of the State. So, yeah, it feels like the session got going to a start. It's a little different. The last couple of years, my majority has had a habit of telling us what the first few weeks are. This one just kind of started.
Just kind of rolling.
Just got going.
All right. Have you been up there too and crossing paths, or are you watching from afar?
Not in person yet. And in fact, in recent years, it's been a little different because I used to make a point to always attend the State of the State in person for years. But since having kids now and family stuff, it's like, it's
bath and bedtime when they do.
I can't, like, sometimes I forget when it's live and I go and watch it after the fact, but I enjoy some of that kind of stuff. I will say when years ago, I was a legislative intern. It was kind of my first experience with the legislative session here in Utah. And during the first week, they had Ronald McDonald, like actual Ronald McDonald on the floor of the Senate doing something. And at the time I remember thinking, because I was new to all of them, like, do we have like bills to get to? Like I was
business?
trying to understand the pomp and circumstance.
And so we get all the fun out of the way and then get down to the business of it. So I do want to talk about the state of the state address. Last night we carried it live. If you were listening on KUTV, our apologies if you do not speak Spanish. The first couple of minutes we were trying to peel off that Spanish translation. It comes from PBS when we all take it, and the feeds got a little mixed up. So want to talk a little bit about, first, whether he hit his mark or not. Governor Cox, I think, has been known for being a public orator who gets good stars on this. Maura, you first. Do you think that he hit the mark of what people were hoping or expecting if they were listening in?
So I think he achieved probably what he wanted to achieve. I think there's a lot of choices with it. If you are a hardcore policy wonk and you view the State of the State is a meaty outlining of agenda items, that's not what that's not the choices that he made. If you think that you love a good speech that sets a tone, has a vision, and has a zeitgeist to it, a moment in time, I think he actually did above average for him. And I think he's a great speaker. I mean, I think he's really good. But to just have too much nuance to it, he was really pacing it well, which sometimes he doesn't always. He had a great pace. He knows. I mean, I've listened to him discuss his point of view on speeches, and he has a strong philosophy about what he wants to achieve and what who the audience was that he was speaking to, and what he wants to leave behind and what people feel. And I felt like he looked practiced, which I think matters. I don't think people realize how much folks prepare for this and how many iterations and how this is a moment. It does get read into the official record. That's why it's printed. Heidi knows they send out copies early because that gets placed in the official journal and marks a moment, a time, and where he is in a place where I think he's legacy building right now. I'm not ready to call him a lame dunk because I think he's got a little bit more time, but we do know he's not running again. So I think he's legacy building. For sure, in my mind, the theme was virtue, and he clearly decided to go with more of a social, moral message and a leadership voice. It was really pretty light on policy and heavy on sort of optimism and differentiating Utah. And so I would say that was by design. So if I said, did he execute his plan really well? For sure. If you are someone who's insistent that what you want to hear is policy, you probably didn't get enough.
And I've learned a fun fact about Nick today, that you actually were a speechwriter for the governor in your past life. Tell me a little bit about the process. Is he one who likes to write things himself? Or does he like others to bring it to him? How does it play out? I think a lot of people don't think about that behind the scenes, that oftentimes it's not the person who's giving the speech who's writing it.
Yeah, so I was the speechwriter for Governor Herbert. So this is
Herbert, okay.
Yeah, well over a decade ago. But that's probably why I said I've tried to attend the State of the State, or at least watch every year, just because kind of having been in the trenches where, I mean, it does. I mean, when I was Governor Herbert's speechwriter, the State of the State we worked on back then was, 30, 40, 50, maybe more iterations, like different versions of the speech. And so it's a very exhaustive process where you pull in the agencies and you pull in the senior staff, and then you go through different outlines of, okay, what do you want to accomplish? And so a lot of stuff ends up on the cutting room floor. But also, I think, to Maura's point, there's a really distinct flavor that Governor Cox has with the way he approaches public speaking, that, there's sort of an ownership that he brings, kind of his unique flair with this sort of aspirational language, and in some ways it is distinct. So that if you think of different ways to do a major speech like this, there is kind of the policy agenda version, that here's the laundry list of things that I want the legislature to do this year. We often see that on the national level as well in the State of the Union. And I think Governor Cox, especially with this speech, but I think also in general, he sort of is giving the mission statement or the vision statement for the state in his view. So it's a really interesting thing that, if you really want the meaty policy agenda from the governor, look at the budget that's released in usually December prior. And this, I think, maybe we could look at it as whether or not it was what the policy wonks would want or what every person in the state of Utah is listening for. I think he gave the speech that he thinks we need. And the fact that he started with references to the 250th anniversary of the nation, he wove in Calvin Coolidge, all this talk of virtue and character. He is so focused in his governorship on the issues of political polarization and how it's tearing this country apart. And I think this speech reflects that we want to get to the meaty work of policymaking, but we can't do it if we don't know how to talk to each other. And so I think that's where virtue comes in, that the skill of talking with someone who you think is wrong on a lot of things, on fundamental issues, but still view them as a collaborator in your effort to solve problems is really unique and needed right now.
One thing that I think is fun to do if you want to go deeper into how you respond to political speeches, and I got this habit from speech writing. And so last night I was with PBS and we were doing a live broadcast. And so you listen to it. If you're listening to it, we all know this from how we listen to podcasts. If you listen to it, it's different than you're listening and watching. The other thing that is fundamentally different is go read his speech. And written speeches will tell you incredibly different things than spoken speeches. And again, I'm using him as an example. I'm not for or against this, but what shines through for our governor as a representative is how well he delivers a speech. When you read that speech, it will be a different speech for you. And there's pro cons to it, but when you're trying to decide things, I always like for people to understand what they're responding to, right? Like, what made us feel good, bad, indifferent, what got us excited. And I think that's an important part of decision making where you are on political issues, because was I responding to the person? Was I responding to the idea? Was I responding to the counter? Was I negatively responding when I should have given that a chance, but I didn't like the delivery? I always just think it's very interesting if someone outlined a policy that you think is meaningful, to go read it as well as absorb it by watching.
Also watching, the fun part is I would never want to be the speaker or the Senate president or with the president, whoever sits behind them as well, because you have to hold your face real nice and you can't squirm or look uncomfortable or itch your face, because then people are like, ooh, he hated it.
Well, and what, Nick, there are lots of side bets going on about what's going to be happening with how neutral the faces are. Famously, do we all remember, for better or worse, when Nancy Pelosi ripped up? None of us even remember the moment other than, did she just do, like you do? And I feel like the perfect face, to be honest, is not too enthusiastic. And you want to be pleasantly neutral.
You need a
if
poker
I were
face
choosing, you got to practice in the mirror.
But you also need to be on the nice side, right? Because then you're like, wow, that guy's a real jerk behind him. And in Utah, the tradition is that you bring your spouse. So that's who I feel like is really doing the public service that night, because they're like, oh man, dude, I have to sit right behind the camera. Okay.
Yeah.
Can I mention one thing that
Yeah.
actually surprised me in the speech in a
Yes.
positive way? And I mean, there were policy things there. We talked about housing, which is arguably the biggest challenge facing Utah right now. And he's been very robust on that issue. But something that stood out to me that I wasn't expecting beforehand, but I realized I needed after he said it. And he references how in kind of the later years of many of the founding fathers, he references President Washington in particular, George Washington, saying that there was, among some of them at least, sort of a concern that, well, this American experiment is failing. And when he talks about that and this sort of uncertainty that they must have had, and then applies that to today, I've thought about this often, that I think we look back on the American Revolution as, oh, they did this great thing and led to this great nation. They didn't know what was going to happen, obviously, in the middle of it, or even after they started, if it was going to work in the long term. And that was really important for me, because I think for a lot of us right now, it feels like a time of turmoil, of conflict, of uncertainty politically for the trajectory of the nation. And the reminder that some of the great people of the past, who are sort of those anchoring leaders of everything that it is to be an American, felt some of that back then. And if they still demonstrated the fidelity to the principles that they put down on paper and tried to live, though imperfectly, as a nation, we can too. So it was just a reminder to me that all the uncertainty and the political turmoil that we're feeling right now, we're in good company. Others have felt that too. And it was really kind of an encouraging moment to me to think, okay, we're gonna be okay as long as we stay anchored to things like virtue and those other kinds of positive things, and reincorporate those into our politics.
I was thinking about that too, and I was thinking that it's a continued action, because, I mean, your country doesn't stay great just because you fixed it and one day said, okay, we've done this and it's done, whether you're talking about marriages or friendships or anything else. It's an active act of keeping sure that it keeps going, and that when there's problems, you work them out and you keep going. So as a country, we might need a little marital counseling right now, but I think
Also
that we can keep at it.
For Republicans, he creates a nice contrast for the discussion going in with the Republican Party about who they are. He is able to weave those narratives pretty well and create a clear contrast between national politics and how we do things in Utah. I'll also note that included in the state of the state is a response from the minority. This was Senator Escamilla and Angela Romero in the House, and it's pre-recorded, so they are giving their response before they have read, although, it's not hard to get a copy. But I will say that I think what's interesting to me is the policy differences right now are not huge in terms of subject matter. It was starkly different in how one approached them. So I'm going to just illustrate. One of the things that Governor Cox brought to the table was reading at grade level, and how important that was to him. Now, depending on the choices you make, you could either say, gosh, this is a chronic problem. It's been around for years. We're not really getting far. Wah, wah, wah. This is hard. He approached it from lots of momentum, optimism, let's get it done. The Democrats, I think this is an intentional strategy, took the loyal opposition, sort of a little harsher, a little more partisan, had a longer list of things that they wanted to tackle. They were sort of challenging that we might be coming up short, which would be by and large a strategy of a minority to take. You still have choices there, but it was noted that they approached it while the policy actually had quite a bit of overlap. Just the tone was approached completely differently.
Yeah, and the same thing with the Democratic response from the party as well, with Brian King saying that it lacks substance and specifics, which we've talked about. The governor obviously made a choice to talk about things kind of on a kind of upper level without getting down to the nitty gritty of how he was going to solve how we'd get a third of third graders reading on reading level, buying a home, addiction and homelessness, social media. He hit on all these issues, but didn't give necessarily specific ways to solve those problems. And I think that's what Democrats were saying is like, okay, well, tell me how you're going to fix it. Is that a fair response, you think?
I think it is, but also putting it in context that, again, the policy agenda, I think in many ways comes in the budget form, because what Brian King says, the chair of the Democratic Party, saying that, look, you have to put values, I think the quote, the values have to show up in policy. And I understand that, but one of the best arguments you can make of how your values inform your policy is what do you put in your budget? And so I think going back to the governor's budget and looking at what they did put in for housing affordability, for education, for all these other kinds of things, is in many ways a better barometer of sort of the robust policy footing of this administration than just what gets put into the speech. And I think also because this is kicking off the legislative session, these are exactly the kinds of things we're going to be talking about and debating over the next, less than 45 days now. The clock ticks fast. But housing alone is one of those issues where, the governor has been so frequent in his discussion of that issue and what needs to be done on the housing front that I would be interested to see where, to Maura's point, is there any or that much difference in policy between the Republicans and the Democrats here in Utah? Because I think we'd all agree we need more supply. We need to build more homes. And that's a little bit of a tactical, logistical policy challenge rather than an ideological one.
Where I think the minority missed the mark is that one should have expected a hearts and minds speech from Governor Cox. And you can disagree about that strategy, but you knew that was coming. You should have known that was coming. And as Nick is suggesting, it's not a good or a bad choice. It's when you want to make your choices, right? But where I think you missed the mark is you don't, in my mind, you don't fight that by giving me something to be against. You can only sort of work it. I would have suggested to the minority that they would have done better.
Their own
to
aspirational.
Also tell me what they're for. And there are other times to give really direct critiques that probably land a little better.
And I think, too, in that, we have heard from many sides of the political aisle, but particularly from folks in the Democratic Party, Utah, around the nation, just because of the controversies of the current president and some criticism of the way he handles things, there has been a lot of discussion really over the last decade about character and virtue in politics, and many people rightfully saying we need more of that in our politics. Now our governor comes out and says that and gets criticized. It's a little odd to me that, well, shouldn't we all be saying, yes, we need prominent Republican leaders, yes, everyone on all sides, but especially prominent Republican leaders to say and model virtue and character in leadership, and that's worth applauding.
While we listened to the governor lay out his priorities, I wanted to look and see how much they match up with what the people of Utah are saying. Right before the session starts, the Deseret News and Hinckley Institute usually do some polling, and they release it kind of throughout the session. And they released already where people are in 2026 in Utah and where their priorities are. And number one was affordable housing at 32%. Number two, healthcare. Going down the list, I should have made this larger. Water in the Great Salt Lake. That surprised me that went as high on the list as it did. Tax cuts coming in after that. Also preparing for a threat of a recession. Homelessness after that. Public education, and then the list goes down. Maura, is this what you expected, or any surprises on the list as to where people were ranking their issues?
No, this is a pretty consistent list, actually. And we usually toggle who sort of didn't come through. That usually does is education in its specificity. That is probably the biggest change. I think these are thoughtful lists. I also do think often these lists reflect what we're hearing about the most.
Yeah.
It's somewhat of a competition for top of mindness. Mm-hmm. So I think the top five have sort of stayed. Water actually is down a position. It was ranking higher when we were in a drought this summer. It's going to rank higher since we've decided that snow is not what we're into. And
weirdest winter ever.
So no, this sort of comported. And one of the things that's also worth saying is the minority caucus and the majorities in both the House and Senate, when they came out with their agenda, they're actually really quite in concert with the results of this opinion poll.
Any surprises on you when you're looking at how everyday Utahns are ranking their issues?
No, I think housing, we've seen some of these pollings for a few years now, and Sutherland, we've done some of our own polling with Y2 Analytics as well, and housing, it keeps on showing up as the top thing. And I think if there's one broad takeaway from this kind of stuff, you look at this list of issues, there's not much on here that you could say is sort of part of culture war politics, or when we think of the extreme partisanship and polarization, the kind of stuff that gets debated on TV and on social media, there's not a whole lot of overlap with that and what we see here. So I think
we're not seeing ICE show up on here, which I think feels like to be the top sort of conversation on national news.
But where it is showing up in polarized and message bills in the House and Senate, right? So I do think it bears a chastising of any legislator who's choosing those perimeter issues over some quite meaty issues that we all want to solve and probably have some room to solve them. So I do think it's incumbent on us as constituents, not in a snarky way, but if your rep is repping these sort of extreme, it's time to say to them, listen, I appreciate it, but that's not where I want your focus. Even if, frankly, you agree with them, it's just not where you want your legislators to be focusing.
Yeah, it may be what you yell about on social media, but when we all go home from work, what we're worried about is, our housing and whether we can afford it. Can we afford groceries? Can we afford our gas prices? Is there going to be water? All the things that kind of affect your family life or your unit that you live with. And that's what you're thinking about, your healthcare costs. And well, it's fun to yell about some other issues that sort of end up being the topics we talk about. It's just the fundamentals that we all basically deal with on a regular daily basis, which I think people mark as their most important, which isn't surprising.
If I can give an analogy for legislators here in Utah or anywhere, any policymaker anywhere in the country for that matter, and this is not mine, I've heard this over the years and I really like it, but this idea of cake, that you need the cake itself and then the icing. The stuff that's on this list that Utah voters are saying they really care about, that's the cake. Like, that's the foundation. That's the good governance, solve problems, make life better, protect our rights, those kinds of things. Some of those issues that are maybe the fiery issues but less relevant to the day-to-day life of regular voters, I wouldn't say that legislators should look at this and say, well, I can't run a bill on anything that's not on this list. But it should be viewed as, we would need to make sure we're doing these things. That's the foundation. If we have the cake, so to speak, then some of the other issues, and again, we would have debates and disagreements over what of those other issues are legitimate and how to approach them appropriately. But that kind of stuff can be sort of the icing that if it is a little bit more of a political issue that you still think is important and you care about, sure, don't do it at the expense of these foundational daily life issues.
Which reminds me of one thing that Governor Cox has brought up for the last couple of years, and I am such an amen to this, and it is the number of bills we have. So
a bazillion.
A bazillion. So we're going to, I think if I remember right, this is give or take, about a week before the session, I went on quick to see how many we were. We had already filed like 400 and something bills, and we were a week out. Now that was just numbered; that wasn't more than titled, and so if we're going to approach 600. What last year, if I remember right, it was like 580 or something ish.
It was a lot,
like that. It's too much, and I will snark and say, yeah, it's too much Republicans. Mr. Small Government, it's too much. Like, enough already. You are too up in everyone's business if you have that many bills.
Yeah.
Particularly in a conservative state. And so I would expect that of those of us on the left. I expect more than those on the right. So I do think part of it is, again, it's not saying that there are lots of smaller meaning specific issues that need to be addressed. And what I love is among the 104 of them, they're seeing a lot of things. And there's rationale and reason for cleanup bills and bills that only affect small groups of people. But interestingly enough, most of them find their way back to 4 or 5 big umbrella issues.
Yeah. And that's interesting that you mentioned that, because I was sitting down with one of our younger reporters. We sit down and try to get to know them, figure out what help they need. And we were talking about the legislative session coming up. And this particular reporter had covered the legislature in past markets where she'd worked. But she said when she'd covered it, there would be during their short session as well, there'd be 4 or 5 bills that would get passed. And so I think when she was looking at Utah's legislative bills, she was just like, whoa, fire hose, where do I go? What do I do? What do I look at? And so, yeah, it's a lot to take in.
Biggest rookie mistake is getting on our great website, right? le.utah.gov if you don't share, and doing too broad of a tracking list, because you're like, ping, 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 and you're like, oh, I'll quickly follow these 500. You really have to know how to search here so you don't get inundated by notifications.
It was a lot. I'm going to get to a couple of those bills that are starting to move through in just a minute. I wanted to touch really quickly on a few other numbers that came from Deseret News, and they're looking at the legislature before they've actually done their jobs right now. 10% strongly approve of what they're doing right now, 37% somewhat approve, 23% somewhat disapprove, 18% say strongly disapprove, 12% are not paying attention and do not care. Nick, does this register with how you see people and how they're looking at the legislative session?
I think it's one of those things that, because we're so early on in the session, obviously I would be very interested to see these kind of numbers as the weeks go on and at the end of the session.
Call me in a month, yeah.
Yeah, because right now it's just sort of a general, I think the average voter, if they're asked, today or before the session starts, what do you think of the legislature? It's a little bit more of a sentiment thing, just kind of what they're hearing and seeing in the news. And then once the legislature actually does the work of governing and voters have more meat to kind of latch onto, I think that's going to give a better sense. But basically nothing in here is super surprising to me. I also wonder how much these kinds of numbers just basically reflect kind of built-in partisan makeup in general, that people might use kind of as a proxy. Well, if I consider myself a strong Republican and if the Utah legislature is mostly Republican, I'm going to generally like them versus not. So I think they're informative, but obviously we need to see how they change as they actually govern.
I think that the numbers I see different is if an opinion research poll holds for likeliness of participation, you see the criticism numbers go up, interestingly enough. So this is a really broad audience that this particular poll uses, and they're very consistent. Their methodology is good, but this is on trend with the last 4 or 5 years. One interesting coupling question that I see in a lot of research that this particular one didn't do, is when you couple it with the question of, are they doing what you expect? Usually that answer's in the 60s. And so some of it is like approve or disapprove is connected to my expectations. And so I like when pollsters couple that with the question of, did the session, I just recently read one, like, is this legislative session shaping up to be what you expected? And I want to say it was like I'm in the mid 60s. And I thought, yeah, if I'm like, meh, I don't know, these guys are doing what I think, that probably impacts also my sense of whether I like or dislike what they're doing, meaning I think it's consistent for that reason.
We were talking about a fire hose of issues that are coming out of the legislative session where it's hard to keep up. I feel like that's an issue when you're looking at the Trump polling. They have some numbers there too. And when I talk to people, even people who support the president, sometimes are like, okay, this is too much all at once, tariffs, trying to buy other countries, whatever's going on. I think so that might where you see some of the softening here. 30% say they strongly approve, 19% somewhat approve, 12% somewhat disapprove, 34% strongly disapprove, and 5% don't know. I'm interested to know the 5% who are just kind of living a happy life, not paying attention to the news. So congratulations to them. This seems to fit sort of with what I hear. Maura, does this fit with what you're thinking as well?
Yeah, I mean, Utah's known for sort of Utah Republicans and conservatives have never been huge sycophants of Donald Trump. One thing that is also interesting is we do differentiate between Trump and MAGA, meaning we like MAGA slightly more than we like Trump, which I always think is a really interesting and why I think communications is so fun, because you're like, okay, what? I mean, like, I love listening to how and what I mostly like about us is how routinely and reliably hypocritical we are. And I mean, I'm that way. I'm like, no, I hate that. But if you say it that way, I'm like, oh, yeah, I like that. I like that too. But we have never loved Trump. We do tend to respond more when you list even MAGA principles. We tend to get a better response.
As President Clinton once said, it depends on what the definition of is.
Yes.
Was he the one who said that?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it depends on how you're describing that. Do you see this line up with how you're talking to people and how they see the president as well?
Yeah, what's interesting, and to Maura's point, this idea of folks maybe liking MAGA a little bit more than Donald Trump, just as maybe a sidebar, but that's relevant, even the term MAGA to now be deployed as if it's a political, ideological movement, rather than obviously the slogan from his first campaign, is really interesting to me, because I think and I say this with whether folks like or dislike President Trump, but for years there has been sort of this grasping on both the right and the left for a coherent governing vision, a philosophy that they can say, well, Trump believes in this set of ideals, and they've turned MAGA into that. They're like, well, are you MAGA or not? And I think right and left do that. President Biden invoked that term all the time, saying the MAGA Republicans. And it's very interesting to me because I don't see a lot of evidence that there is a core philosophical, vision-based, cohesive governing philosophy per se. But yet we are so used to that as voters that I think we try to graft that on a little bit. And this is a unique era of our politics. It's unique administration. That is maybe the understatement of the year. But our attempts to sort of graft that on are maybe what part of that is, that folks might say, well, if maybe I don't like certain aspects of the way President Trump does things or the way he tweets or those kinds of things, but I like the policy outcomes X, Y, and Z. And maybe if they say those X, Y, and Z things are MAGA, maybe that's what we're seeing there.
Yeah, I also think it's frankly a third party, right? Because one, I would make the argument that that your descriptions also fit the Republican Democratic Party to some degree, right? I mean, yes, they adopt platforms, but most people who identify have not reviewed the platform. It's a general feeling about, and we now use them not as policy guidestones, but as T-shirts for our tribes. And I think he just provided another version of a tribe for us to join. And so it does make it interesting to ask the question about what I'm being responsive to. What is it that I'm validating or not?
Now we're talking about MAGA. I'm wondering who came up with that phrase, and they're probably patting themselves on the back because you don't usually keep repeating something that was your campaign slogan how many years ago, and it's sort of stuck. So whether you like it or not, they got in your brains. Next poll numbers lead us into another issue that's a hot topic in Utah right now. The question is whether you approve of the deportation methods used by ICE and the Border Patrol. 25% strongly approve, somewhat approve, somewhat disapprove, or 14%, and strongly disapprove, 39%. Those numbers coming in as there's finally word boiling and bubbling to the surface that there is a possibility of a new ICE facility coming to Utah. This came to light from the Salt Lake City mayor, who caught wind that a business owner possibly had a warehouse they were looking to either sell or lease to the federal government for this. It all kind of came surprisingly to me that so many people were shocked and surprised by this, because I've talked to several people who are in the know on this, and we've talked to Representative Ryan Wilcox, who was here last week, who can tell you that this is a process that's been ongoing for at least a couple of years. It started under the Biden administration, where they were looking for something that was a little bit closer to the I-15 corridor up here. Salt Lake City heads up a multi-state jurisdiction, and it takes a lot of effort and money to try to send people always down to the desert of Las Vegas. So this is an ongoing conversation. Maura, people, I think, with what we're watching in Minnesota right now, are all of a sudden aghast that this is coming up. Should people be worried in Utah that we're possibly going to get a detention center here, or are they just two totally different topics, and you got to separate out what you're seeing in Minnesota as to the conversations going on here about a possible new facility?
I mean, I think people for sure need to be watching what the interaction is between this federal agency and where states' rights are, and sort of just the notion. The challenge with this is just what you said. There are layers to it, and there are slight different directions, and they are all connected, but they are all different, right? Meaning ICE 2-3 years ago was just looking for an independent detention agency because their requirements were so onerous that local jails just couldn't comply, or didn't want to, rightly so, couldn't comply with providing those beds. So the conversation 3-4 years ago was bed space and compliance with federal really bureaucratic regulations. And then what the role is of ICE has been the conversation. So where I think the discussion is what do you want the role of this federal agency to be? You see a Trump administration that is clearly leaning in to the most aggressive, permissive form of this federal agency. And that includes rounding up people pretty indiscriminately, from my point of view, and where due process is. And that's where most of my concern is. Because it's so heavy, now you start looking at site locations and what that represents. So if 3 years ago, maybe that represented a more alternative jail beds, and they were controlled by the federal government. Maybe I still even don't like that, but that's about jail beds and federal government and all of that. For me right now, the discussion is a facility feels like it's supporting an agency that I think has gone a little off the rails from a directive point of view, because I feel like President Trump has clearly, and his folks have clearly said, we will never prosecute. So that's the trick, is that they have to follow state law, but it gets weird because state law can't prosecute a federal officer that is following a federal law. So yes, they can't break a state law, and the federal government, I think wrongly, has said, yeah, we won't agree to ever prosecute an ICE agent. That is wholly irresponsible, regardless of your position on immigration. Everyone needs to have accountability within the organization that they work for. So for me, that's where it does get layered. I think it originally started out as a holding facility. I do think there are federal state issues. I think, to be frank, this issue is more layered for the right than it is for the left, because I think the left doesn't line up with a lot of the policies on immigration. They don't line up with these roles. I think there is a push and pull between, are you going federal over state, which is not a normal conservative Utah position, and you may like this notion of immigration, but that doesn't mean you also like how it's being enacted. That there's some complexity.
Yeah, federalism's a big one, I think, coming up in a lot of issues of who has control and who should have control. When you look at the issue, do you see Utah as needing an ICE facility when you look at everything that's going on and helping to, I guess, reach the goals of what ICE needs and help the people of Utah, or is this just the wrong direction?
Well, I think Maura's point is correct, that I think if you're asking people today, just sort of on the street or survey or whatever, do you support an ICE facility in Utah? My guess is that's really just going to be a proxy for how they feel about the broader issue of immigration enforcement, the way the administration is handling it. And so to that extent, it's not particularly useful to help answer the logistical question that you're asking and that Maura rightfully described of the bed space, the logistics, all these kinds of things. It's more just, essentially, you might as well just ask us, well, how do you feel about the way immigration is being handled in the country today? Because I think at the core, you're really asking the same thing. And the reason I think that's important is that we do need to have a conversation in this country that so often we get sucked into the extremes. On one side that uses anti-authoritarian style language to describe ICE and makes references to the Gestapo and things like that, I don't think are productive at all. And then folks on the other side, if there is kind of this attitude of like, well, they can do no wrong, or that they're all just doing everything perfectly, I think there's a little bit of a parallel, not entirely, but a little bit to some of the conversations we've had about law enforcement in general over the last 10 years or so. And very different things, obviously, but from the standpoint of when there's a use of force, like this shooting we saw recently that's been in the news a lot, the actual use of lethal force, we should evaluate through the lens of the law, the policy, and those kinds of things. And to the extent possible, keep it separated from the broader political controversies. That's been hard to do in just local law enforcement use of force in some high-profile cases that we've seen hit the news in the past. I think it's even harder to do right now. And so it's tough, but that's what we should be doing, is separate out what are the logistical needs and what is the appropriate way to enforce immigration in this country, and how do we do that while curbing some of the concerning excesses that we've seen. That's a conversation I don't see a lot of people having. It's either to Maura's point, if they're saying, well, we're not going to prosecute, like this is everything from top to bottom that ICE is doing is exactly what we need to be doing, and then other people saying we need to abolish ICE because they're Hitlerian tools of an oppressive state. I think there is a middle ground that, of course, there is an appropriate lawful way to enforce immigration laws, and the law says you're not allowed to be an illegal immigrant in the United States. We need to find a thoughtful way to address that is in accordance with the law, and I think compassion is valid, but in a way that straddles that line that I don't think anyone's having that conversation right now.
I think the challenge, though, becomes when the politician is inserting themselves. In this instance, I'm going to argue that Donald Trump has chosen, and is his prerogative, to insert politics into the policy. Usually there's a little more give on it, and even an ideological elected official knows when to stop and let process take over. That is not Trump's strategy or philosophy in governance. And so when he leans so into what appear to be closer to political agendas than policy agendas, it leaves very little room for grown-ups to be grown-ups. And I think that is why you're seeing, actually, I think that if there's any silver lining, it's that you're seeing more and more coalescing around the issue of process and doing the right thing, and letting go a little bit more of the ideological stuff. That is where Utah can be a leader. I mean, the Utah Compact was revolutionary and so quintessentially Utah. Like that I remember during that time and being a part of those conversations, and you were like, yeah, this all makes sense. We put away some of the brands and just said, well, who are we as people? Where do we want to be accepting? Where do we want to be law-abiding? We want to be both. We are all law-abiding. We are all accepting. And we really, the coalition on the Utah Compact was enormous. And I think you see those indicators showing up in these poll results.
And can I say, I agree with Maura entirely. And I think it creates a parallel to the governor's state of the state when he talked about virtue and character. If we are not seeing the kind of restraint or policy focus or virtual character from our elected leaders, such as if the president is being political and bombastic or whatever it is on this issue, that doesn't mean that we kind of pull back and say, well, he's not creating space for us to do it. It means we have to engage more, and especially at the state level, to Maura's point, that's where we need to be the kind of ourselves, virtuous, character-driven self-governors that we can.
Yeah. And I do think that political nature is really what's kind of the flashpoint right now, because when you look back historically, people have called Obama the deporter in chief, but he wasn't putting his face, his politics into it. So it was happening, but it was happening quietly behind the scenes. ICE was doing their thing, and he wasn't putting his face on it, which I think that Trump does, and I think has created a lot of that flashpoint. So we will keep paying attention to that issue as it comes. I wanted to mention that State Senator Nate Blouin had a bill they were calling the ICE out bill. It was in committee yesterday. It was pretty much dead on arrival. It was killed in committee. The sheriffs came and they spoke out against this bill, saying that they really need to have the ability to work with ICE and to have that ability. This bill would have cut that off. It also was looking to keep them out of churches and schools and hospitals, also not wear face coverings. Maura, do you think this was the right vote, or did it deserve more discussion?
I think it was the inevitable vote. So, I mean, I have a hard time not just pointing out that Nate Blouin knows this and intentionally will say, I will never pass a bill. So the politics around it
He's
are,
running for Congress
you have
right
a
now,
sponsor intentionally. So to that, I don't think the bill was written to have much traction in terms of a yes vote. I think that this was him stating some truths that he believes to be true. So on one hand, I'm like, to the conversation we had, it's your prerogative, write your bill the way you want. The one area I am passionate about that I think that deserves the conversation is the face coverings, and time and place and manner. But it almost, I'm having a hard time mustering getting too deep on the policy, because I think that the committee was about political theater on both sides. So.
It makes me think of something that I heard from a colleague who happened to be on a different side of the political aisle than I years ago, and it's always stuck with me. And this person asked, she said, when you're evaluating public officials, or anyone for that matter, ask yourself, do they want to make a point, or do they want to make a difference? I don't particularly love the idea of pushing legislation that is purely intended to make a political point and doesn't have other objectives to try and make a constructive difference in some way. I'm not, if that's what this was, I don't know. But I think in that context, that I think so much of this comes down to what you do versus how you do it. And Heidi, you mentioned the Obama administration and some of the really high deportation numbers. I think that's one of the things that some folks on the political right, who maybe in general are predisposed to liking President Trump and some of the things that the administration does, I think they get frustrated at times correctly when they say, well, a lot of this stuff has happened under President Biden, under President Obama, but now because it's Trump, you just don't like it. So I think there's some justified correctness in that argument, that some of this stuff is not as outside the norm as we think. It just wasn't covered under previous administrations. But where I also think that falls flat is the show and the spectacle seems intentional in the current administration more so than the actual governance. And so that's why I come back to what are you doing versus how are you doing it? I think most Americans would agree, yes, we need to secure the border. Yes, we want to get the violent or dangerous criminals who are here illegally out of here. I think there is a little bit more squishiness, if you will, around folks who the only violation they've committed is crossing the border or overstaying a visa illegally, but otherwise have been totally law-abiding, and that's where there's room for true political debate and policy discussion, which is, I mean, we've had this debate over and over again. The George W. Bush administration back in 2005 or 2007 presented a plan that was fairly comprehensive, addressing all these kinds of things. There have been iterations of that under both parties for years, and we just haven't gotten it because maybe too many of us as voters want the spectacle and the political fight rather than the solution. And that goes back to, again, the virtue and character question that we have to ask ourselves.
And if I bring this back to a state level to just add to that, the minority voice. So I'll sort of really express the minority voice. I love that screen of, is this theater, is this productive? Because where I think we sometimes mess that up is if the bill had passed 6-3 out, we would not think it was theater. That may or may not be true. So majorities bring theatrical message bills and they get passed. There's something about the action of it passing as validating, obviously. And I think that's where the minority gets frustrated, is it's super easy to look at a minority and say, y'all are, you chirp, chirp, you're bringing up, aren't you so angry? And scoff, you are not doing this, but like scoff at sort of all your issues or message bills and look at all of us are substantive and supportive because we have the votes. Like one of my biggest frustration in largely working with Republicans is I have found a general attitude in which I have an opinion, but you are right. And I'm like, no, we both have opinions and you have the vote. Those are two very different things. If I go to another state, suddenly am I right? No. And if we can approach it saying, well, best approach is we have two different opinions, let's get to a common solve. But if we can, I've noticed it has nothing to do with ideology, but supermajorities confuse having the votes with being right. And that's where I argue, too, that there is this superfluous arrogance, virtue signaling that should be equally dismissed, but sometimes isn't, because when you pass out, you think, oh, well, that must have been reasonable, right? And I'm like, no, y'all just had the votes. So I say that by way of saying I love your screen about what really should we be looking for as successful legislation.
Successful legislation that's going through. Before we came into the podcast, it looks like the Senate has passed through after it went through committee yesterday. The Utah Supreme Court justices moving from 5 to 7. I'm sure we'll be discussing that in the weeks to come. Anything you guys want us to know on that issue before we move on?
I mean, our listeners know this. This is what we call a leadership bill, and it will take its journey. This is one of the highest priorities, I will say under my breath, it's retribution, but one of the highest priorities for the leaders, and the prerogative of leadership is likely you'll be successful.
You do you have anything on that one?
Well, I'll just point out that, and the legislative leadership and the folks pushing this bill have been making this argument as well, that there is an argument to be made as far as just the structure of the court and the population growth of Utah. And some others have said, look, we've been actually having the same conversation for a couple of years now. There are other legislators, I believe, who have proposed or talked about proposing something similar. I think Maura's right that even if that is all substantively correct from the messaging side, you're still going to have to grapple with the perception that is this sort of timing based because of decisions that they didn't like. So I think it'll be up to the proponents, obviously, to make a firm argument for the substance of that. But that is one of those ones that I think I'll just articulate the principle of the screen. I like that term, Maura, that we should have in mind is in these kinds of issues, we always need to come back to what is the appropriate role of each branch, what is true appropriate checks and balances versus what is overreach. And I'll just leave that for the listeners to think through the lens on this one and other debates that will come up.
And there is a consensus around growth for lower courts. I'll point out, I think the fight is about the Supreme Court. I think both the judiciary and the legislative branches think there's growth for this. And also what I would just point out, which maybe we can talk about with our speaker, if you're making a fundamental policy argument that we've become more complicated and volume has gone up and complexity has gone up, ergo we should expand the courts, I'm like, oh, so I assume next season we'll be talking about expanding the 45-day session and the 104 elected officials. Because y'all, with your 600 bills, you're barely keeping up. And growth is growth. And if our systems need to grow to accommodate, and I'll use the same and I'll leave Wyoming out, oh, look around. Other Western states have much bigger legislative branches than we do, and that's another indicator of good policy when it comes to the judiciary. So I am presuming that next year we're going to take a look at expanding our session and the number of people we have elected, because we've been growing.
Don't make us talk about this for more than 45 days.
I know.
I want Nick to have a second while he's here to talk about one of the bills that he's working on right now. And this is the government benefits to self-reliance. It's SCR 7. It's a concurrent resolution. Tell me what this is and why it matters.
Right. So just for the listeners, resolutions are typically, this might sound weird coming off the last segment, but resolutions are typically message bills. They're articulating a position from the state, but they can be very substantively impactful. and important. This is an example of those because we've had a big discussion as a country over the last couple of years, especially after the One Big Beautiful Bill in Congress being passed, a lot of the responsibilities kind of shifting to states when it comes to social welfare programs. What this resolution essentially does is it expresses the official position of Utah to the federal government, saying basically, here in Utah, we're really good at running social welfare programs. We're the only state in the nation that has the one-door model where welfare programs and workforce programs are co-located in one statewide agency. We have the highest upward mobility in the nation. We have some of the best job growth rates in the nation. We have low poverty. There are a lot of metrics showing that just the way we do things in Utah when it comes to upward mobility is really good, and in many ways is a gold standard for the nation. And the resolution essentially identifies these things, but then says there's obviously more we could do at the state level to improve upward mobility, to address poverty, but we face constraints from the federal government. A lot of these social welfare programs, you think of food stamps, Medicaid, things like that, they're federally created, federally funded, and then the states administer them. And sometimes there's not a lot of flexibility that states have to actually be innovative and try new things. If a state like Utah says, hey, we think we could actually do a better job of getting people out of chronic poverty and into work-based self-reliance, but we can't do certain things because of federal rules, this resolution essentially says, let states have a little bit more innovation authority to try these things. And I think the two benefits of something like this are, number one, just from a substance standpoint, there's a lot of good evidence that we do things in Utah in a better way than a lot of other places when it comes to these kinds of upward mobility-based programs. So I think we can come up with better solutions. And the federal issue is such a mess where you have 80-plus federal programs, $1.3 trillion and rising, reporting to different congressional committees and different federal agencies. It's going to be really hard to come up with creative solutions to poverty on the federal level. Let states take a crack at it, basically. And then the second benefit of something like this is ties into everything we've been saying. So many of these issues that are controversial are so controversial in part because they've been pushed to the national level. And yes, elected officials at the national level can make it worse. If we had more issues that were more decided at the state level, I really think that'll reduce some of the feeling of existential partisanship and polarization, because at the state level, we just have to get things done and we can be better at it. So that's the brain dump, if you will, of why I think this resolution actually could affect the debate on the national level.
I was as I was getting caught up to speed with this proposal that Nick and the Sutherland Institute have put a lot of time into. It was as he's described. There's a lot of room for mutual ideology here. This isn't ideologically driven, and if you can build in, this is step one. Resolutions, as Nick outlined well, some are meaty. Not all resolutions have nothing. They are building consensus around major concepts, and particularly the federal congressional representatives often need this consensus. So this consensus around states handling certain issues better. One of the reasons you want consensus is you want some security that this will be consistent funding still, that they will not get fickle when they weren't in control, they being the federal government, and that states can, in fact, handle these issues better. It's also, if you're interested in this and start looking into it, what is really great is they're pulling in sources from the Atlanta Federal Bank, which is doing the most, but like the city of Cleveland has really leaned into it, and it's a Democratic city. Pointing out that saying, gosh, if you would dedicate a certain amount of our commonly held, again, I paid for it, commonly held rightful distribution of federal money, we will actually do a better job staying up, staying innovative. The federal system is so slowly moving that inevitably it's 2 generations behind. Even at its best, states can adopt better and adapt better. We have a proven track record here, but I do think this is one of those good examples where it is a resolution, but it has some meat. And from my point of view, there should not be anyone who's having much consternation with this. This is a government collectively securing some security for those among us who need it the most.
You always look at states, and it's kind of interesting because states were all in the same country, but there's vastly different cultures, economies, ways of dealing with each other and understanding each other. So it makes sense that when you're closest to it, you can help figure out how to solve those problems. So we will be watching as that happens and comes up on the floor for debate. Lightning round here, I want to mention a few things. This is a federalism fight with national and local that's been going on for decades, but the BLM has finally approved the updated Northern Corridor Highway Plan. If you don't live in southern Utah, you probably haven't thought about it and haven't cared, but this could start construction in the next 3 weeks. There are some people still hoping that they can fight it. This is some area that's been protected for the desert tortoise that's been down there. Do you have concerns as you see this approval, Maura? Or
yeah, huge
is this
concerns.
the right
This
way?
has been hugely controversial. This got rammed through. I think this is going to have environmental ramifications that we will never recover from. So I think this is bad news.
Turtle recovery problems or just in general for...
The entire ecosystem, I mean, the turtle has been the flashpoint, the rationale for these restrictions for the BLM, but I think the ecological fragility of southern Utah and the amazement that it is that we have this in our state, I think we're at a point where growth isn't always trumping, and that's not our only path to economic security, is to continue to grow. And this plan was put into place when we were at no holds barred growth, and I don't think that's the era we're in right now.
I'll just say, so one, I don't think I'm as deep in this issue as Maura is, but I will say that broadly speaking, I don't think we get to decide whether or not Utah grows. And so if the question of, should this development happen, is sort of that, well, do we want to grow or not? The growth is coming. The growth projections are pretty clear. All we get to decide is, do we want to have really expensive houses and really congested roads, or do we want to have more housing and more roads? Now, I will concede that, obviously, though this comes back to what you do versus how you do it. The way that you would accommodate increasing transportation infrastructure, which I think there's a very clear argument that we need more of that throughout the state. The way you do it and balancing it with those other kinds of factors that are genuine concerns, I think is important. But I would just frame it as, we can't just stop the growth, so we do have to look at the policy trade-offs and how do we grow in an intelligent way that balances the right values.
We could have solved this problem if we would have lived up to the Jetson expectations and did away with roads and just started flying. If you look back, we've really done everything the Jetsons expected of us, except for that. We're not flying to work, which is a big disappointment. Social media based Mike Lee, as in Senator Mike Lee, ruffling some feathers this last week. He was calling for the public execution of Charlie Kirk's accused killer. Does this matter, Nick, or does he have free speech like everyone else, even if he's a senator and he can just say what he wants because he was closely connected and can be emotional like everyone?
Oh, of course, he has free speech just like we all do in this country. I think this is one of those things that there obviously are, rightfully so, a lot of strong feelings around the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and we should have an appropriate reaction to that kind of criminal act as a country. I don't view this comment as something that is ultimately that important or necessary or a good idea per se. I mean, I think that even if for folks who get deep in the debate over the death penalty, for example, even proponents of the death penalty should have a sense of restraint or somberness, that if the state does make a decision to take someone's life because the crime they've committed is so egregious, we should treat that with a degree of somberness and not sort of flout it, I guess. So it's kind of going back to, again, I keep referencing the governor's speech, but that idea of character and virtue, that, you know, if we have the death penalty and if that's what the criminal justice system decides is the appropriate punishment if found guilty and those kinds of things, then do it with due respect, which might sound a little odd when the state is taking someone's life. But putting it in that context, I think, is important.
I think it's fair for me to judge my senator about does he share some of the ideas, but frankly, I've voted for people who don't share all of my ideas. I do get to decide if he is a leader who reflects my character and my virtue, and does he express things in a way that make me feel proud, whether I agree or not. And Mike Lee is just not living that for me in the last year or so. I've always disagreed with his policy positions, but in the last couple of years, I don't think he's, for me, shown himself to be a person of virtue or character. And I mean, just stay off of social media is the message to the kids.
All right, he needs a bell-to-bell
He does need a belt.
Grounding from his phone. I hate to leave on such a serious topic, but we are out of time. I do want to mention really quickly that Scott Pressler, who was in town last weekend, is returning for a second weekend, hoping to help Republicans in the state gather signatures
I am
for the
doing
repeal
my
of Prop 4.
part. On my way back from lunch the other day at City Creek, I held up a signature gather for a good 10 minutes before I let him go because I'm not signing that petition. So I feel like I'm doing
So
my
you
part.
took up 10 minutes of his day?
Yeah, I felt like it was a mistake on the training on the guy's part because I thought, why are you not cutting bait on me right
didn't
now?
cease and desist?
But he didn't want. No, I was perfectly fine, and we were very cordial. He was very good actually, and bravo for him. He was very good. But Nick knows when you do these grassroots training. Step number one is if they're not going with you, cut bait and move on. And I kept thinking, this guy is continuing to talk to me. What a nut.
Were you like insinuating? Oh, I might sign. Help
No,
persuade. Or
I
you were
didn't
saying
even
I
go
am
that
okay.
far. I outed myself because I wasn't. We weren't like it wasn't contentious, but he just kept doubling down, and I was like, you really? Sure, I got time. So I felt like I've done my
You've
part.
done your part.
So I will be headed towards you if you're signature gathering.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being a part of the conversation. Speaker, I was going to call him Hughes. He was a past speaker. This is Speaker Schultz, who's actually in charge right now. Will be joining us for the podcast next week. And the Libertas Institute is dropping its first ever poll. So we have something to look forward to. Thank you, both of you, for being a part of the conversation. Maura, good luck to your team.
Thanks. I'll be in Denver this weekend for the championship game.
Go Broncos.
Yeah.
Do you have a horse in the dogfight? Or now I'm mixing up all my animals with football. I'm not a football hugie.
No, we were Chiefs fans, and so now we're just kind of watching for fun.
I'm a Chiefs fan too,
That
but
means
mostly because I love Taylor.
You're pro AFC going in, I'm assuming, too.
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Let's be on the same team. We're in the same conference.
Oh, good. I checked out when Taylor Swift's boyfriend
When
was
she was
out.
in.
Yeah,
Fair enough. Fair
that's
enough.
how I am. Thanks for joining. Have a great week, everyone.